Ukraine's recent incursion into Russia's KSK region was a bold and symbolic move, signaling the Ukrainian military's willingness to take the fight to Russia. For a brief moment, it looked like this could mark a pivotal shift in the ongoing conflict. This was an audacious act that, even if not strategically transformative, could have altered the morale of the Ukrainian forces and their supporters. It was for Ukraine an opportunity to demonstrate that the war is not just being fought on Ukrainian soil, and that Russia too could be vulnerable to strikes within its borders. But this triumph was fleeting. Ukraine's incursion into KSK did not lead to a turning point, but rather unleashed a severe and brutal retaliation from Russia. Within days, Moscow responded with overwhelming force, launching an estimated 100 missiles and 100 kamikaze drones against Ukrainian infrastructure and civilian targets. The attack spanned 15 different locations across Ukraine, with explosions echoing in cities as far as Kyiv, the nation's capital. This massive counteroffensive was designed not only to punish Ukraine for its boldness, but also to serve as a stark reminder of Russia's continued military dominance. The devastation was immense. One of the key targets of the strikes was a hydroelectric power plant in Kyiv, a critical piece of infrastructure that powered large portions of the country. With this plant heavily damaged, power outages began to spread across Ukraine, plunging many districts into darkness. As winter approaches, the destruction of Ukraine's energy infrastructure threatens to exacerbate an already dire situation, with the cold season likely to compound the suffering of millions of civilians. This moment highlights a grim truth that has characterized the Ukrainian resistance since the start of the war. Every military success Ukraine achieves is met with brutal retribution from Russia. The nature of these retaliations reveals that Russia is willing to go to great lengths to inflict maximum damage, even if it means targeting civilian infrastructure. The attack on the hydroelectric power plant is a prime example of this. It wasn't just a military target, but a critical component of Ukraine's energy supply, showing that Russia's strategy goes beyond mere military objectives. It's about crippling the country's ability to function as a modern state. The missile and drone strikes also claimed the lives of 6 civilians, a stark reminder that in this conflict, it is often the innocent who pay the heaviest price. For every strategic gain Ukraine makes, it must contend with the fact that Russia's military can and will strike back in ways that go beyond the battlefield, targeting the very lifeblood of the country's infrastructure and the civilians who rely on it. For Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, the incursion into KSK was likely intended as a strategic maneuver to force Russia into negotiations. By showing that Ukraine could strike deep into Russian territory, Zelensky may have hoped to pressure Moscow into reconsidering its stance and potentially open the door to ceasefire talks. However, this calculation appears to have backfired. Instead of leading to negotiations, the incursion has led to an escalation, with the Kremlin dismissing the possibility of a ceasefire entirely. Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin's spokesperson, made it clear that ceasefire negotiations were no longer relevant, signaling that Russia has no intention of stepping back or negotiating under pressure. This response from Russia is not surprising. From the outset of this conflict, the Kremlin has maintained that it would not negotiate from a position of weakness. The incursion into KSK, while a momentary victory for Ukraine, did little to change the balance of power on the ground. Russia's response, deploying missile and drone strikes on a massive scale, was a message to Ukraine and the world. No matter how many tactical victories Ukraine may win, Russia's military remains a formidable force capable of inflicting catastrophic damage at will. In many ways, this back and forth of attack and retaliation has defined the course of the war. Ukraine's resistance, characterized by its smaller, more agile military operations, stands in stark contrast to Russia's overwhelming use of force. Ukraine has been forced to adapt to a war of attrition where every gain is followed by a heavy price. The incursion into KSK was no different. The momentary success of that operation was quickly eclipsed by the sheer scale of Russia's retaliatory strikes. What makes these attacks even more devastating is their focus on civilian infrastructure. By targeting energy facilities, Russia is not only striking at Ukraine's ability to power its military, but also its capacity to provide basic services to its population. With winter fast approaching, the destruction of Ukraine's power grid could lead to widespread suffering. In many regions, the power outages triggered by these attacks have already left millions without electricity, and the situation is only expected to worsen as the cold season sets in. This is not just a military strategy, it is psychological warfare. By crippling Ukraine's energy infrastructure, Russia is attempting to break the spirit of the Ukrainian people. Living in darkness, with sporadic access to heat and electricity, Ukrainian civilians are being subjected to a form of collective punishment. The message from Russia is clear. Resistance will only lead to further suffering, and yet Ukraine's resilience has been remarkable. Despite the constant bombardment and the destruction of critical infrastructure, the Ukrainian people have continued to resist. Air raid sirens are a daily reality, and many civilians have sought refuge underground, but the will to fight remains strong. This determination is perhaps Ukraine's greatest asset in the conflict. While Russia may have the military might, Ukraine has the spirit of its people, who have shown time and again that they are willing to endure great hardship in defense of their sovereignty. However, the toll of this war cannot be ignored. The psychological impact of living under constant threat is immense. For many Ukrainians, the sight of kamikaze drones and missile strikes has become a regular occurrence. Fires burn in cities across the country, and the plumes of smoke rising from destroyed buildings are a daily reminder of the war that shows no signs of abating. In places like Odessa, where Russian missile strikes have targeted critical infrastructure and military facilities, the scale of the destruction has overwhelmed local firefighters who struggle to contain the blazes. The constant air raids and missile strikes have also placed immense pressure on Ukraine's emergency services, which are stretched thin by the sheer volume of attacks. In Kyiv and other major cities, firefighters and first responders are often working around the clock to deal with the aftermath of these strikes. The destruction caused by Russia's bombardment is so extensive that it will take years, if not decades, to fully repair the damage. And as long as the war continues, the possibility of rebuilding remains a distant hope. Russia's use of advanced military technology, including short-range ballistic missiles like the Iskander, has also underscored the imbalance of power between the two countries. In one instance, an Iskander missile strike on a Ukrainian city left dozens of vehicles destroyed and engulfed in flames, a powerful reminder of Russia's ability to inflict devastating damage without even setting foot on Ukrainian soil. These attacks highlight the extent to which Ukraine remains vulnerable to Russia's superior firepower, despite the significant gains Ukraine has made in its defense capabilities. As the war drags on, the situation for Ukrainian civilians grows increasingly dire. Many have taken refuge underground, but even the relative safety of bomb shelters cannot provide relief forever. Eventually, people must return to the surface, where the threat of Russian airstrikes is ever present. The reality for many Ukrainians is that there is no escape from the conflict. Whether above ground or below, the danger is constant, and the psychological toll of living under such conditions is immeasurable. Looking at the broader context of the war, it is clear that Ukraine's decision to invade KSK has escalated the conflict into an even deadlier phase. What was once a defensive struggle to repel Russian forces has now become a war where both sides are willing to strike deep into each other's territory. This shift has dangerous implications, not only for Ukraine and Russia, but for the wider international community. As the war escalates, the risk of further involvement from external powers grows. Ukraine's Western allies, including the United States and NATO, have provided significant military and financial support. But the question remains, how much more can they do without directly provoking Russia? The incursion into KSK was a gamble, one that Zelensky and his military hoped would force Russia to the negotiating table. Instead, it has led to an escalation that threatens to prolong the war indefinitely. Russia's refusal to negotiate and its continued use of overwhelming force suggests that there is no end in sight to this conflict. For Ukraine, this means enduring more missile strikes, more drone attacks, and more destruction of its infrastructure. But Ukraine has also shown that it will not be easily defeated. Despite the immense challenges it faces, the country remains united in its resistance. The Ukrainian military continues to fight on multiple fronts, and the government has worked tirelessly to maintain the support of its Western allies. However, the road ahead is fraught with danger. As winter approaches, the destruction of Ukraine's energy infrastructure could lead to a humanitarian crisis on a scale not yet seen in this war. In conclusion, Ukraine's brief moment of triumph following its incursion into KSK has been overshadowed by the harsh reality of Russia's military might. The war has entered a new phase, one where both sides are willing to take increasingly bold actions. For Ukraine, the stakes could not be higher. As the conflict continues to escalate, the country will need to rely on the resilience of its people and the support of its allies to survive the challenges ahead. And while the future remains uncertain, one thing is clear: the fight for Ukraine's sovereignty is far from over.